Isabella Leclerc had grown up in a world cushioned by silk sheets, crystal chandeliers, and endless privilege. Her father, Henri Leclerc, was the founder of a European luxury hotel empire, worth billions. Their estate sat on a hill outside Paris, overlooking the Seine like something out of a painting. Tall, ivy-covered walls, gardens trimmed with military precision, and fountains that sparkled at night. To Isabella, this life was normal. She had never known a world where her requests weren't granted, or where the ground beneath her wasn't marble. Yet Henri Leclerc was not blind to the dangers of this kind of upbringing. He had fought his way from nothing, born to a dock worker and a seamstress, and he believed in hard work, grit, and humility. Over the years, he watched his only daughter become detached from the very values that had built his empire. She dismissed employees with a wave of her manicured hand, mocked the drivers who ferried her between charity galas, and thought of work as something other people did. So when Henri grew ill, he devised a plan. The inheritance of his fortune, nearly 5 billion euros, would not be automatic. Instead, Isabella would face a test, a challenge to prove that she had the strength, wisdom, and humility to handle the empire. On her 24th birthday, dressed in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver, Isabella was summoned to her father's private study. He sat in his leather chair, thinner than she remembered, his breathing shallow, but his eyes sharp. "Papa," she said lightly, kissing his cheek. "You wanted to see me? Don't tell me this is about another one of your long lectures." Henri's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. "Sit, Isabella. This is no lecture. This is your future." She arched an eyebrow but sat, crossing her legs elegantly. She was used to getting birthday gifts that sparkled. Necklaces, sports cars, even a penthouse in New York. But this time, Henri slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "You wish to inherit everything," he began slowly, "but wealth without wisdom is a curse. You will not receive a cent, not unless you pass my test." Isabella laughed, assuming it was a joke. "Papa, don't be dramatic. Everyone knows I'm your only child. Who else could take over?" Henri's voice sharpened. "Don't laugh. The empire needs a leader, not a spoiled child. For 1 year, you will live without luxury. You will work, earn, understand the lives of those who serve you. If you fail, the inheritance goes elsewhere, into trusts, charities, and the hands of those who deserve it more." The laughter drained from Isabella's lips. She stared at him, her perfect nails tapping the desk. "You can't be serious. You want me to live like a peasant? To work?" Henri's voice broke, but his resolve did not. "I am serious, and you will begin tomorrow." The next morning, Isabella awoke expecting to find her usual breakfast tray of croissants, fruit, and cappuccino. Instead, her wardrobe was locked, her jewelry gone, her phone confiscated. Her sleek sports car had vanished from the garage. A single note lay on the table. The test begins. A driver will pick you up. Her protests echoed through the mansion, but no servants appeared to indulge her. At 10 sharp, a modest black car, not a limousine, pulled up. The driver didn't wear a uniform. He was an older man with rough hands and tired eyes. He offered no bow, no mademoiselle. "Miss Leclerc?" he asked. Isabella narrowed her eyes. "Who are you? Where is Bernard? Where is my driver?" The man shrugged. "Name's Jacques. Your father sent me. Let's go." Against her will, she slid into the back seat. The leather was cracked, the air faintly smelled of cigarette smoke, and there was no chilled champagne waiting. She felt suffocated. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded. Jacques grunted, "To your new home." Half an hour later, they pulled up to a cramped flat on the outskirts of the city. The building leaned tiredly against its neighbors, paint peeling, windows smudged. Inside there was no chandelier, no marble floors, only a small bed, a wooden table, and a leaky faucet. Isabella's jaw dropped. "Absolutely not. I refused to stay here. Papa wouldn't." But Jacques interrupted. He would. And he did. "You've got a year here. No staff, no chef, no designer gowns, just you." Her rage boiled. She stormed about, muttering about lawyers and rights, but the door clicked shut behind Jacques. She was alone. That night, for the first time in her life, Isabella cooked for herself, or at least she tried, burning the pasta until the smoke alarm wailed. She went to bed hungry, curled up in thin sheets, shivering at noises from the street outside. She thought this was the lowest point, but worse was coming. Because in less than a week, Isabella would not only lose her comfort, she would lose her job, fail her father's test miserably, and in her desperation, climb into the back seat of a taxi driven by a man who would change her entire life. The first week felt like a nightmare Isabella couldn't wake from. She had gone from having 3 housemaids attending to her wardrobe to fumbling with wrinkled dresses she'd bought from a second-hand store nearby. Her shoes pinched her feet. The cheap makeup she tried to use never blended right, leaving her once pristine face looking patchy. The neighbors in her building weren't the type she was used to meeting at charity banquets. The woman across the hall, with sagging eyes and 2 toddlers clinging to her legs, didn't smile when Isabella strutted by. A man downstairs worked odd hours and often shouted into the night. Instead of music from orchestras, Isabella heard babies crying, toilets flushing, and televisions buzzing through the thin walls. Worst of all was the job. Her father had arranged one for her, of course. On her second day, Jacques, the same rough-handed driver, had dropped her at a small cafe in the city. The owner, Madame Fournier, wasted no time explaining. "You'll serve tables, Clean them too, and smile, she said, narrowing her eyes at Isabella's scowl. Customers don't care about your name. They care about their coffee being hot. Isabella had never worked a day in her life. Carrying trays felt like punishment. Balancing steaming cups made her hands shake. The first time she spilled coffee on a customer's lap, the man shouted, and Madame Fournier had to apologize on her behalf. Isabella muttered under her breath, "People like that should be grateful I'm even here." But customers weren't grateful. They frowned at her attitude, whispered about her incompetence, and left coins instead of tips. By the end of her first week, her feet ached, her back hurt, and her pride was in ruins. On the 7th day, she snapped. "I'm done," Isabella hissed as she stormed out of the cafe after a customer barked at her for forgetting extra sugar. Madame Fournier shouted something about responsibility, but Isabella ignored her. She grabbed her coat, marched to the street, and kept walking. For the first time in her life, Isabella had no plan. No limousine waiting, no credit card to swipe, no one clapping at her beauty. She walked until her legs burned, past boutiques where mannequins wore dresses she could no longer afford, past restaurants where couples dined under warm light she couldn't enter. She found herself sitting on a bench by the river, staring at her reflection in the dark water. Her makeup had smudged, her hair frizzed in the evening damp, and her once polished nails were chipped. She didn't look like Isabella Leclerc, the heiress. She looked ordinary. Her stomach growled. She realized she had barely eaten all day. She dug into her bag and found a wrinkled €5 note. Enough for a cheap sandwich, maybe. The humiliation burned. How dare Papa do this to me, she thought bitterly. He built everything so I could live in luxury. Why make me suffer like this? But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Or maybe he built it so you wouldn't become this." She silenced it. She wasn't ready for truth yet. The days that followed blurred into survival. She lost the cafe job after storming out. Madame Fournier made it clear. "Don't come back. I don't need spoiled girls who think they're above work." Without the cafe's small pay, Isabella struggled even more. Rent was barely covered by the allowance her father had set, an amount so tiny compared to her past spending that she had to choose between food and electricity. For the first time in her life, she skipped meals. She learned the sting of hunger. Her pride crumbled when she had to take odd tasks just to earn coins. Handing out flyers, cleaning up after events, even babysitting a neighbor's unruly children. Each task stripped away another layer of arrogance. Yet she resented it all. One rainy evening, her shoes soaked and her hair plastered to her forehead, Isabella ducked into the only shelter she could find, a bus stop. There, she overheard 2 women speaking about her father's company. "They say Henri Leclerc is sick," one whispered, "and no one knows who'll take over. The daughter? Ha! That girl? She couldn't manage a corner shop." Isabella froze. She wanted to scream at them, defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat because they were right. She walked home that night with shame clawing at her chest. For the first time, she realized she had failed her father's test. It happened 2 weeks later. Isabella had gone out in desperation, searching for work. The rain poured down again as if mocking her, and she held no umbrella. Shivering, she raised her hand for a taxi. The car pulled up, headlights flashing against the wet pavement. She slid inside, dripping water onto the seat. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind but weary eyes, glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. "Tough night?" he asked. Isabella groaned. "Tough life." The man chuckled. "You're too young to talk like that. Where to?" She muttered her address, and the car moved forward. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the engine. Then, as they passed through the glowing streets of Paris, the driver spoke again. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes the hardest nights are the ones that teach us the most." Isabella rolled her eyes, ready to dismiss him like she dismissed everyone else. But something about his tone, steady, unpretentious, almost fatherly, stirred her. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she didn't feel like she was being judged. She felt seen. She looked at the driver properly now. His hands were rough, veins bulging. His clothes were simple, a little worn. Yet there was calm in his eyes, a depth she couldn't quite explain. "Easy for you to say," she muttered. "You probably don't know what it's like to lose everything." The driver smiled faintly. "On the contrary, mademoiselle, I know exactly what that feels like." Isabella frowned, curiosity pricking her through the fog of her misery. For the first time, she leaned forward and asked softly, "What's your story?" And that question would open a door she never expected. A door to truth, humility, and the very lessons she needed to pass her father's impossible test. The driver's voice was calm, almost too calm for the restless storm inside Isabella's chest. He hadn't raised it once, not when she rolled her eyes or when she muttered bitter remarks. That patience irritated her, but it also drew her in. "What's your story?" she asked, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from whatever truth he might reveal. The man gave a small laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has lived through enough pain to find humor in it. "Name's Victor," he said. "I wasn't always a taxi driver. I used to own a business, small, but it was mine. A garage on the south side. Worked on cars, fixed engines, employed 10 men. We did well until the recession hit. People stopped coming. Banks wanted their money. Lost it all in less than a year." He paused, eyes fixed on the road. The city lights flashed across his face like broken memories. "I had a wife," he continued. She didn't like being poor, couldn't handle watching me struggle. One morning I woke up and she was gone. Took my son with her. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. That was 10 years ago. Isabella blinked. She had asked out of boredom, but suddenly she felt a lump in her throat. And you just drive taxis now? Victor shrugged. It pays the rent, keeps me alive. Life doesn't always give you what you want, but it always gives you choices. The words hung heavy in the air. Choices. Isabella thought about the ones she had made, mocking waitresses, scoffing at chauffeurs, abandoning a job because she couldn't take a little criticism. She had choices too, but she had always chosen pride. Still, she muttered, trying to shake off the discomfort. It's not fair. Losing everything like that. Victor's eyes flicked to her in the mirror. Fair? Life isn't fair, but maybe it's not supposed to be. Sometimes the unfair parts teach us what the fair parts never could. Isabella fell silent. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have a snarky reply. The ride should have ended there, but something strange happened. When the taxi pulled up to her apartment block, Isabella didn't want to leave. There was something about Victor, something steady, grounding. "Keep the meter running," she blurted. "Drive me around a bit more." Victor raised an eyebrow. "That'll cost you." She smirked faintly. "Don't worry, I can afford it." Though truthfully, her purse was frighteningly light. They drove aimlessly through the city, past the glittering Champs-Élysées, where luxury boutiques mocked her with memories of who she used to be, past the dimly lit streets where homeless men huddled beneath newspapers, past cafes full of laughter she no longer belonged to. Everywhere they went, Victor told stories. Stories of passengers who tipped him generously and passengers who treated him like dirt. Stories of single mothers he drove home late at night, exhausted from double shifts. Stories of rich businessmen who bragged about fortunes while ignoring the world outside their tinted windows. Each story was like a mirror Isabella didn't want to look into. For the first time, she saw the invisible threads of a city she had always floated above. Threads of struggle, sacrifice, survival. "You see," Victor said, pulling the taxi into a quieter street lined with old lampposts, "everyone has a fight. Some people wear it on their sleeves. Others hide it behind diamonds and silk. But the fight is always there. Money doesn't erase it." Isabella pressed her forehead against the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. A thought whispered in her mind. Is this what Papa wanted me to see? Their rides became more frequent. At first, once a week, then every few days. Victor never asked why she called him instead of hailing another taxi. He simply arrived, patient as ever, and drove her where she needed or didn't need to go. One evening, as the Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance, Isabella finally confessed. "My father cut me off," she said quietly. "He said I had to live like this, or I'd lose my inheritance." Victor didn't flinch. "And how's that going?" She gave a hollow laugh. "Terribly. I failed at waitressing. I burned pasta. I can barely survive without crying. Everyone thinks I'm useless. Maybe they're right." Victor pulled the taxi to a stop by the curb and turned to face her. His gaze was steady, unshakable. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "Failing doesn't make you useless. Failing and refusing to learn does. You think you've failed your father's test? Maybe. But maybe the test isn't about waiting tables or cooking pasta. Maybe it's about learning what you've been blind to all your life." His words struck something raw inside her. She had always thought of failure as the end, but here was a man who had lost everything: his business, his family, his pride, and yet he still carried himself with dignity. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. Victor smiled faintly. "Because once someone showed me the truth when I didn't want to see it. Now it's my turn to pass it on." That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She tossed on her creaky bed, Victor's words echoing in her mind. Failing doesn't make you useless. Failing and refusing to learn does. She thought of the waitress she had once mocked for moving too slowly, of the chauffeur she had scolded for taking a wrong turn, of the gardener she had sneered at for dirt on his hands. They had all been fighting battles she never saw. And she had failed. Not at her father's test, but at being human. For the first time since the ordeal began, Isabella cried. Not angry tears, but tears of realization. The next morning she called Victor again. This time she didn't ask him to drive her through glittering streets. Instead, she asked him to take her somewhere she had never been. "Where to?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Take me where real people live, where it's hard, where life doesn't come with silver spoons." Victor's eyes softened. He nodded and started the engine. As the taxi rolled forward, Isabella didn't know what awaited her. But deep inside, she felt a shift, the faint stirrings of humility, a seed of change. And though she couldn't know it yet, that single choice, to learn instead of resist, was the first step toward the truth that would save her inheritance and her soul. The taxi hummed steadily as Victor guided it away from the shining heart of Paris. Isabella watched in silence as the neon lights faded, replaced by narrow streets where cracked buildings leaned wearily on one another. Laundry hung from balconies, fluttering like tired flags. Children kicked a ball in the street, their laughter echoing against the walls, while mothers shouted warnings from upstairs windows. "This isn't the Paris you're used to," Victor said quietly. Isabella pressed her lips together. He was right. She had only ever known Paris through champagne glasses, rooftop parties, and fashion shows. Yet here, life felt raw, unpolished, but strangely alive. Victor parked the car and turned to her. Come, tonight you don't just ride, you walk. At first, Isabella hesitated. The streets felt foreign, dangerous even. She tugged her coat tighter, afraid her clothes screamed of privilege. But Victor walked calmly beside her, greeting people with nods, his presence a shield of reassurance. They passed a corner where a man played accordion for coins. Isabella noticed how many walked by without sparing him a glance. She remembered how often she had done the same, dismissing street musicians as background noise. Now, with only a few coins in her own purse, the music sounded different, fragile, hopeful, a plea for survival. Do you ever stop to listen? Victor asked. She shook her head. Then listen now. So she did. And in the melancholy notes of the accordion, Isabella heard something she had never heard before, the quiet fight of a man who refused to give up. Victor led her further. At a soup kitchen, volunteers handed out steaming bowls to a long line of men and women. Their coats were threadbare, their shoes broken. Some looked no older than Isabella herself. She froze, ashamed. These people, she whispered, they look like ghosts. Victor's voice was steady. They're not ghosts. They're stories. Some lost jobs, some lost homes, some lost hope. But they all keep walking. They fight, even when the world forgets them. One of the volunteers caught Isabella's gaze and smiled warmly. Without thinking, Isabella smiled back. It was small, hesitant, but real. For the rest of the evening, she helped serve soup. At first clumsy, spilling ladles and fumbling with bowls, but slowly she found a rhythm. The people who came through the line didn't look at her with the scorn she expected. They looked at her with gratitude. For the first time since her fall, Isabella felt useful. Later, as they sat on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp, Isabella exhaled heavily. I never knew. I never wanted to know. Victor studied her. And now that you do? She stared at her hands, still smelling faintly of broth. I feel small, like I've lived in a glass cage and everyone else was outside fighting just to breathe. And I mocked them for it. Victor nodded slowly. Humility doesn't come from being told you're wrong. It comes from seeing the truth with your own eyes. Tonight, you saw. The weeks that followed became Isabella's true education. Victor drove her to neighborhoods she'd only seen in news reports, places where families crowded into single rooms, where children studied under streetlights because electricity was too expensive. where markets bustled with sellers shouting prices that changed with each desperate negotiation. Each place carved away at her arrogance. She met a seamstress who worked 18 hours a day to feed her 3 children. Isabella had once scolded a seamstress in her mansion for taking too long to adjust a gown. Now she saw the calluses, the needle-pricked fingers, the exhaustion hidden behind the woman's tired smile. She met a young boy who sold flowers outside cafes late into the night. His English was broken, but his grin was bright when someone bought a single rose. Isabella had once scoffed at street sellers as pests. Now she realized each flower he sold meant food on the table. She even met an elderly man who reminded her of her father, stern, proud, but worn down by life. He sold handmade wooden toys no one wanted anymore in the age of screens. Isabella bought one, cradled it in her hands, and fought back tears. Through all of this, Victor never lectured. He simply let her see, guiding her gently but firmly, like a lantern in the dark. One rainy evening, after helping unload food donations at a shelter, Isabella asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Victor, why do you help me? You could just drive me around, take my money, and forget about me." He smiled faintly. "Because once I was like you, not rich, but blind. I thought my struggles were the only struggles that mattered. Then someone, an old mentor of mine, opened my eyes. If he hadn't, I would have drowned in my own bitterness. You remind me of me, and I believe maybe you can change." The words struck her deeper than she expected. Maybe you can change. No one had ever told her that before. People had called her spoiled, arrogant, selfish, but no one had believed she could be anything else. For the first time in her life, Isabella wanted to prove someone right instead of wrong. One night, after weeks of these lessons, Isabella returned to her shabby apartment and sat at her wooden table. She pulled out a notebook she had bought from a street vendor and began to write. At first the words were clumsy. She wrote about the soup kitchen, about the seamstress, about the boy with the flowers. She wrote about hunger, about fear, about shame. But as the pages filled, something strange happened. Her heart felt lighter. For the first time, she wasn't writing about herself. She was writing about others. She stayed up until dawn, pages scattered around her like fallen leaves. And when she finally laid her head on the table, tears slipped down her cheeks. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of awakening. The next day, when Victor picked her up, Isabella looked different. Her posture was softer, her eyes clearer. "I think I understand now," she told him. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" "That Papa's test. It's not about surviving in poverty. It's about seeing the world without blinders. About learning that money means nothing if you can't respect the people who earn it with their blood and sweat." Victor smiled, a rare smile that reached his eyes. "Then you're closer to passing than you think." What Isabella didn't know was that her father's eyes were still on her. Quietly, from afar, Henri Leclerc had kept track of his daughter's progress. He knew she had failed at the café, knew she had stumbled, but he also knew something had shifted. And soon she would be tested again, not with soup ladles or cheap apartments, but with a decision that would reveal whether she had truly changed, or whether this was all just an act. The crisp winter air stung Isabella's cheeks as she hurried through the city. Snowflakes drifted lazily, frosting rooftops and settling on her worn coat. She hugged it close, no longer embarrassed by its thrift store origins. For once, her mind wasn't on appearances. It was on purpose. Weeks of lessons with Victor had reshaped her like a sculptor chiseling marble. The arrogance that once defined her was cracking, revealing something raw and unfinished beneath. But deep down, Isabella wondered, had she truly changed, or was she just pretending? That question would soon be answered. One evening, Victor pulled his taxi to a stop outside her apartment. "I've got a favor to ask," he said. Isabella tilted her head. "A favor? From me?" He nodded. "A friend of mine runs a small community center. Kids go there after school, keeps them off the streets. They're short on volunteers. Thought maybe you could help." The old Isabella would have laughed. Babysit poor kids? Absolutely not. But the new Isabella, though still uncertain, found herself nodding. "I'll try." The center was a squat building painted in fading colors, its windows fogged from the heat inside. The moment Isabella stepped through the door, chaos engulfed her. Children darted between tables, crayons scattered everywhere, soccer balls bouncing against walls. A weary woman approached, relief washing over her face. "You must be Isabella. Thank you for coming. We need all the help we can get. Can you supervise the reading group?" Isabella swallowed her panic. Reading group? She hadn't read to children since, well, never. But she nodded and followed the woman into a corner where 6 wide-eyed kids waited with battered books. At first, her voice trembled as she stumbled over the words. The children giggled, not unkindly, but with the brutal honesty of youth. She blushed, unused to failure in such an innocent setting. But then, remembering Victor's advice, "Don't give up, learn," she steadied herself. She read with more confidence, adding voices, even dramatizing the story. The children laughed, this time with delight. When one little girl crawled onto her lap and asked, "Will you come back tomorrow, mademoiselle?" Isabella's chest ached in a way she couldn't explain. Days turned into weeks. Isabella returned to the community center again and again. She helped with homework, painted walls, even organized a fundraiser by calling old contacts, without revealing her identity as an heiress. Victor watched quietly, pride shining in his eyes. "You're learning something even money can't buy," he said one evening as they drove home. "What's that?" she asked. "The joy of giving without expecting anything in return. But life has a way of testing lessons at the moment they matter most." One afternoon, as Isabella was leaving the center, she found herself face to face with a woman she recognized, Chantal Dubois, her old socialite friend. Chantal stood in a fur coat, diamonds flashing at her ears, a smirk curling her lips. "Isabella Leclerc," Chantal sneered. "So it's true. You've fallen. Volunteering with street rats?" Her laugh was sharp. How tragic. Once the queen of parties, now queen of charity cases. Heat rose in Isabella's chest. The old her would have fired back with venom. But now she stood still, hands trembling only slightly. "They're not charity cases," she said firmly. "They're children. They deserve as much as we do. Maybe more." Chantal's smirk faltered. "So, you've gone soft. No wonder your father cut you off." Those words pierced deep. Isabella clenched her fists, but instead of lashing out, she breathed slowly, remembering Victor's voice. "Respect the fight in others." She straightened her shoulders. "If choosing kindness makes me soft, then I'd rather be soft than cruel." Chantal's eyes widened. For the first time she had no clever reply. With a huff, she turned and stalked away, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. Isabella exhaled, her whole body shaking. She had stood up not for herself but for the children. And for once, she didn't care about winning an argument. She cared about being right in her heart. Victor, who had witnessed the exchange from across the street, approached with a proud smile. "That," he said, "was your turning point." A week later, the true test arrived. The community center faced closure. Funding had been cut, and without money for rent, the doors would close in a month. The children cried when they heard the news. The weary woman who ran the place wiped her eyes and whispered, "We've tried everything. We can't raise enough." Isabella's heart clenched. She thought of her father's empire, of the billions she had once considered hers by right. She thought of the endless galas where guests spent more on wine than this center needed to survive. For the first time, she didn't long for that wealth for herself. She longed for it to help them. That night, she sat with Victor in the taxi, staring at the city lights. "If I had my inheritance, I'd save the center," she said softly. "But I don't. Not yet." Victor looked at her. "Then fight for it. Prove you're worthy of it. Not for you, for them." Her eyes filled with determination. "Then I'll do whatever it takes." The next morning, Isabella made a decision that shocked everyone. She went back to her father. For the first time since she had failed his test, she walked into his study, not in designer clothes, not with diamonds in her ears, but with tired eyes, a patched coat, and a notebook full of the stories she had written. Henri Leclerc looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Papa," she said, voice trembling but firm, "I don't deserve your fortune. Not yet. But I've seen what it could do for people who need it. If you give me another chance, I promise I won't waste it on myself. I'll fight for them." For the first time, Henri's stern mask cracked. His eyes glistened. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you are finally becoming the woman I hoped you would be." The silence in Henri Leclerc's study stretched like an eternity. Isabella stood before her father, clutching the worn notebook filled with stories of people he had likely never met, people whose names would never grace the newspapers or stand beneath chandeliers at glittering galas. Her father leaned back, eyes narrowing, weighing every detail. Her posture, her trembling voice, the exhaustion written into her skin. For years, Henri had worried that his empire would die with him, swallowed by his daughter's vanity. But now, for the first time, he saw not the spoiled heiress, but a woman. "Show me," he said finally, pointing to the notebook. With shaking hands, Isabella opened it. Page after page spilled out before him. The seamstress who worked her fingers raw, the boy selling flowers under neon lights, the old man carving wooden toys for a world that no longer cared. And woven into every story was a thread of humility, a voice transformed by pain, touched by compassion. Henri read silently. When he finished, he closed the book and pressed it to his chest. His voice, when it came, was softer than she had ever heard. "You've passed." Isabella blinked. "What?" "You've passed my test, ma fille. Not because you suffered, but because you saw. Wealth without sight destroys. Wealth with compassion builds. You are ready now." Tears blurred Isabella's vision. For weeks she had longed only to prove herself, but now she realized she had gained something far more precious than money: her father's belief in her. The days that followed changed everything. Henri formally reinstated Isabella as the heir to his empire. Lawyers updated documents. The media speculated, gossiping about the rebellious heiress who had disappeared and returned with a new fire in her eyes. But Isabella no longer cared for the gossip. Her first action wasn't to buy gowns or cars. It was to save the community center. Standing before the children and volunteers, she announced with tears in her eyes, "This place will never close again. You have my word." The room erupted in cheers. Children rushed forward, hugging her legs, their laughter ringing like bells. For the first time, Isabella felt the weight of power not as a burden, but as a gift. Of course, not everyone welcomed the new Isabella. At a society gala weeks later, she faced Chantal Dubois again. The woman sneered as usual. So the princess is playing savior now? Chantal said, swirling champagne in her glass. Do you think charity makes you better than the rest of us? Isabella smiled calmly, no venom in her tone. No, Chantal, it doesn't make me better. It just makes me human. You should try it sometime. The crowd around them chuckled. For once, Isabella didn't bask in their approval. She had spoken her truth, and that was enough. But the most important meeting came one cold evening, months later, when Isabella returned to the taxi stand where Victor always waited. He looked up in surprise as she approached, no longer in rags, but not in jewels either. She wore a simple coat, her hair loose, her face radiant not from makeup, but from peace. You don't need a taxi anymore, Victor teased, though his eyes glimmered. Isabella smiled. Maybe not. But I needed to see you. She stepped closer, her voice thick with emotion. Victor, you showed me the truth. You gave me the lessons my wealth never could. Without you, I would have failed forever. He shook his head. No, Isabella. I just opened the door. You chose to walk through it. Her eyes filled. Then let me thank you properly. I want you to come work with me, not as a driver, as an advisor. Help me build something better, something for people like the ones you showed me. Victor hesitated, humbled. You'd trust a taxi driver with your empire? She took his hand, firm and steady. I'd trust the man who taught me how to see. From that day forward, Isabella and Victor worked side by side. They launched foundations for education, housing projects for struggling families, and programs to support small businesses like the one Victor had lost years ago. The Leclerc empire was no longer just about luxury hotels. It became a beacon of responsibility, a model for how wealth could serve the world instead of consume it. Isabella grew into her role not as a pampered heiress, but as a leader. Newspapers no longer called her spoiled, they called her visionary. And though praise came, she never forgot the nights of hunger, the children with broken shoes, the soft wisdom in Victor's voice. Years later, after Henri Leclerc passed peacefully in his sleep, the empire fully became hers. At the funeral, hundreds came. Employees, dignitaries, even the seamstress and flower boy she had once written about. As Isabella stood at the podium, her father's legacy heavy yet steady on her shoulders, she spoke with a voice that carried across the hall. My father built this empire with his hands. I will carry it forward with my heart. Not for me, for all of us. Victor, standing quietly in the back, smiled. The spoiled girl he once picked up in the rain had vanished. In her place stood a woman forged by truth, humility, and courage. And so, the story of Isabella Leclerc became not one of failure, but of rebirth. A rich heiress had indeed failed her inheritance test. But a taxi driver showed her the truth, and in doing so, helped her rise as the heiress her father always dreamed she could be.